Greetings. I'm a primary care doctor for adults, and I'm going to talk today about why welcome refugees into our community. About 10 years ago, our practice in the suburbs closed, and I moved down to the inner city clinic, and I was amazed by the number of refugees that we took care of in the office. And I realized I didn't know much of anything about refugees, and I was teaching medical students and young doctors to care for them. And I had a lot to learn, and it really was stimulating to me in my career to work with them. And first and foremost, the question was, what is a refugee? So I'm not going to assume that you know what a refugee is. A refugee is part of that big umbrella of immigration, and they are legal residents that come to the United States as part of our humanitarian effort. Refugees cannot return to their country of origin for legitimate fear of persecution or death. And that's as determined by the United Nations High Commissioners on Refugee. The only difference, as you see here on the slide, between refugee and asylum seekers is where they are when they apply to come into the United States. If they come to the United States, they're here and they apply, they're seeking asylum. If they're outside the United States, applying to come into the United States, they're refugees. And the UN estimates that there are about 17 million people of refugee status in our globe today. If you combine that with the people that are forcibly displaced from their homes, but still within their country of war usually, there's about 65 million people, more than since World War II. So what's the process when they come? When they come here, we do a physical exam, and that's where I first meet them. And the purpose of the physical exam, obviously, is to check for any illnesses that need some treatment. But it's also to make sure that they're fit for work. Because refugees receive public assistance temporarily until they're, quote, economically self-sufficient within a few months. And if they're not, then their job coach gives them a piece of paper, sends them to me to assess their functional limitations. Now, there are challenges with refugees, obviously with language barriers. There are challenges with them trying to navigate our complex medical system. But disability is one of those challenges that is really quite frustrating. And I've been practicing for 30 years and have actually never had a formal course in disability determination. So it's not something most doctors really work to do or like to do. And it's quite cumbersome with the paperwork, even for people that have an obvious physical impairment, like somebody with an amputation, a refugee that's had a bomb blast. But it's really a challenge for the refugees that often have post-traumatic stress disorders. Because just like our veterans of war, post-traumatic stress disorder is very common in refugees. But in medicine, we call it the great masquerader, because it doesn't present with somebody coming in saying, I'm having nightmares and I'm worried and I'm depressed. They come in suffering from physical, often pain or problems. And I do my exam and I do my tests, and it often doesn't find something objective and tangible. And I certainly often don't have something that is a quick fix. And that can be very frustrating for the refugee, and it's often frustrating for the provider. And my frustration reached a peak several years ago, and I was at home and I received then this invitation in the mail to the annual benefit dinner for one of our resettlement agencies here in our community, Interfaith Works. And I saw that they were honoring some refugees, but it was a weeknight. I really did not want to go, and I recycled it into our bin at home. And my wife says to me, but wait a minute, you gotta go. You know all these refugees. And I pulled it back out and I looked at the picture and realized I don't know any of these people. These were people that were leaders in our community, and I wasn't familiar with them at all. These are not the people I'm seeing in the office. And the light bulb went on, because I wondered, are these exceptional people the exception? Or are the people that I'm seeing suffering in the office, are they the exception? And my bias possibly is fake news. So I started to research it and look. And there wasn't really anything in our books about disability with refugees, so we studied it. And the details of our study are in the Journal of Immigration and Minority Health. But to summarize, yes, we showed definitely PTSD. We screened refugees when they first came into the country, and emotional distress, PTSD, very common. 1 in 3 adults immigrating refugees suffer from PTSD. But it didn't predict that they would then be seeking disability. In fact, the vast majority of them were working. And I learned from that yes, emotional distress is common in refugees. And what do they do about it? They work through it. They literally work through it. And then we looked at, well, what is the true prevalence of disability in the refugees? At that time of the study, the U.S. Census data said that for adult U.S. citizens, age 18 to 64, 10.5% of them, 1 in 10, claimed that they were disabled from unlimited duty. What did we find the prevalence for refugees to be? 11%. 1 in 10. The same as our fellow Americans. So I concluded from that our refugees in our community are doing their best to make America great again. Winston Churchill said that greatness comes with responsibility. And a buddy of mine, fellow physician, we had talked about this, and I told him the results of our data, and he says, okay, I know they work, but why here? Why bring them here? We don't have any responsibility for what's going on over in Syria. And I had to argue back at that. Because we invaded Iraq in 2003. And that opened the floodgates for refugees in the Middle East. Where do refugees flee to? They usually flee to the country next door. So in a 2-year span, Syria, next door to Iraq, took in 1.5 million refugees from Iraq. Jordan took in 500,000. By 2007, same period, the United States had taken in less than 5,000 Iraqi refugees. Jordan is the size of Connecticut. Syria is a little bigger than our state of New York. Imagine 1.5 million people flooding in from Canada with no belongings, and we've taken them. I've got to believe that that has an impact on our economy, and particularly the Syrian economy and their society, and plays a role in their current crisis. And by 2011, they were in full-blown civil war. And we've all heard that as much as 1 million of the refugees fled across the waters to Western Europe. But it's less known that many just went next door again. And Turkey now hosts the most refugees from Syria, with 3.5 million Syrians in their country. And Lebanon, the little country of Lebanon, has now host to 1 million Syrian refugees. 1 in 5 residents or people living in Lebanon are Syrian refugees. Lebanon is the size of our community here in central New York, and they have taken in 1 million refugees. So we invaded Iraq. It opened the floodgates, and it really has caused, I think, a crisis in the Middle East. And for years, we did take some refugees, even though it was a trickle. But President Trump now has really shut off the tap and washed our hands of the refugee crisis. We're starting our second quarter here in 2018, and thus far, we've resettled 11 Syrian refugees. Now, I must say that this big global picture of what's going on is not what motivates me to take care of refugees. It does not get me through my day. What gets me through my day is the opportunity to get to know a refugee. And it's odd, it's paradoxical, because here I am taking care of them, trying to heal them. And what I find is that I receive a real sense of belonging because of them. And I actually feel very much at home with them. And I think the best way to express that is to share with you a phone call I had with my mother when she was alive. At the end of the day, I would call my mom to check on her. And I called her one night in June and asked her, "How was your day?" And she said, "Oh, I had a wonderful day. I went up to your brother Dave's, had dinner. We sat out on the back patio overlooking his potato patch." And she described these lush green plants with white blossoms on top, supported by rich, dark soil piled beneath them, and there were no weeds in the patch. She said it was beautiful. And then there was a pause. And she said, "I just hope they're not toppers." And that phrase, "I just hope they're not toppers," flashed me back to the end of a potato row in June, next to my dad leaning on a hoe, saying, "I just hope they're not toppers." Now, for those of you that are not potato farmers, a topper is a root plant, like a potato, that puts all its energy up in the plant. And when it comes time for harvest, you go underground and get the potatoes, there's very few potatoes. And that's a big deal for a dad who has to raise 7 boys, and we had potatoes on the table every night through the winter. But I reassured him, I'm going to take care of those potatoes, and they're going to be all right. But little did I know that June is about as good as it gets for the potato plant. You get to the dog days of July and August, and the ground gets hard and it cracks, you can hardly hoe it. and the weeds start growing and you can't keep up. And it seems like the harder you work, the worse those plants do. And you begin to wonder, why am I doing this? Until the fall. And Dad announces on a Saturday morning that we're going to go harvest the potatoes. And my brothers and I go out to this field of just weeds. And you look for these little spindly remnants of a plant, and you start digging. And it was like digging for treasures. We would compete to see who could find the hill with the most potatoes, the biggest potato, the funniest looking potatoes. It was digging treasures. And as I reflected on that after talking to my mom, I thought, taking care of refugees is a lot like being a potato farmer. They come in and we're all excited and everything seems hopeful. And then as you work with them, you find that it's a lot of work. And they have been through a lot. And they are suffering. But I also find that they are incredibly resilient and very hopeful. And our differences really just melt away. And the only differences that I find is that I was born and raised in a potato patch, and they were born and raised in a war zone. I was blessed with a healthy, loving family, and many of them lost their family. I was raised in a community with good public schools that allowed me to live my dream of being a doctor, and their community blew up in their face. I am very privileged. We as Americans are very privileged. In a lot of ways, we're like that lush green potato plant with lots of potential. But I just hope we're not toppers. It is time to let the refugees come in and be welcomed into our community. We have been vetting them very successfully for decades. And I assure you that if we support them, when they come into our community, they will take root and they will grow. And they will not be toppers. And we will all harvest treasures.